There is a photograph from Warsaw, taken in August 1939. A mother is walking her two children to school. She is holding their hands, and all three of them are smiling. The sun is shining. The street behind them is full of people going about their morning. Shopkeepers are opening their doors. A man is reading a newspaper at a cafe. Everything looks completely ordinary. That photograph was taken 11 days before the first bombs fell. 11 days before that street would become unrecognizable. The mother in that picture had no idea what was coming. Nobody did. And that is the part of war that history books often skip over. The days before everything changed. The last ordinary morning. The final time a family sat together at breakfast without fear. This is the story of those days and the people who lived them. If this is your first time on this channel, consider subscribing. We tell the stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments of history. No politics. No military strategy. Just human beings trying to survive. Before we talk about what war does to a city, we need to understand what that city looked like when it was still at peace, because the loss only makes sense when you know what was lost. And in almost every case throughout history, the cities that would soon face destruction were full of life just days before. Markets were crowded. Factories were running. Children were playing in the streets. People were falling in love, getting married, starting businesses, making plans for the future. They were not preparing for disaster. They were simply living. Take Berlin in the early 1940s, before the heavy bombardment began. Families still went to parks on Sundays. Restaurants were open. People complained about the weather and worried about paying rent. Yes, there was a war happening somewhere far away, but for most civilians it felt distant. It was something they read about in newspapers or heard on the radio. It was not yet something that touched their daily breakfast or their walk to work. The human mind has a remarkable ability to believe that the worst will not happen, that somehow the danger will pass, that the conflict will stay over there, wherever there is. This is not stupidity. This is simply how people cope with uncertainty. They hold on to normal life as long as they possibly can. In Leningrad, which is now called St. Petersburg, the summer of 1941 was beautiful. The city was famous for its white nights, when the sun barely sets and the sky stays bright until midnight. Families walked along the canals. Young people gathered in parks. The war had started, but it was happening on the borders, hundreds of miles away. Most people believed the whole thing would be over in a few weeks. They had been told this by officials, and they wanted to believe it. So they continued their routines. A factory worker still showed up to his shift every day. A grandmother still tended her small garden. A young woman still planned her wedding for the fall. None of them knew that within months their city would be completely surrounded, that they would face one of the longest and most devastating sieges in modern history. But in those summer days, they had no way of knowing. And so they lived as people always live, one day at a time. This pattern repeated itself in city after city, across different wars and different decades. In Manila in late 1941, Christmas decorations were going up. The city was busy with holiday shopping. People were excited about the new year. The threat of conflict was discussed, but it felt abstract. And then, within weeks, everything changed. In Sarajevo in early 1992, people were still going to cafes. The city had just hosted the Winter Olympics a few years earlier. It was modern, cosmopolitan, full of energy. The idea that it could become a place of prolonged suffering seemed impossible. But the impossible has a way of arriving without warning. What all these moments have in common is the ordinary nature of daily life just before disaster. Historians sometimes call this the last normal day, but in reality, it was rarely just one day. It was a slow fade. A gradual shift that most people did not notice until it was too late. The signs were there, but they were easy to ignore. Prices went up a little at the market. Certain goods became harder to find. A neighbor mentioned that his cousin had left the city. The radio news became more serious. But none of these things, on their own, seemed like the end of the world. People adjusted. They told themselves it was temporary. They believed that things would return to normal soon. There is something deeply human about this response. When faced with uncertain danger, most people do not panic. They wait. They watch. They hope. A shopkeeper does not abandon his store at the first sign of trouble. A mother does not pull her children out of school based on a rumor. People need certainty before they act, and war rarely announces itself with certainty. It creeps in slowly. A little more fear each day, a little less food each week, a little more tension in the air, and then one morning everything is different. In the cities of Europe during the Second World War, this transition often happened over the course of weeks or even months. In some places there were official warnings, air raid drills, instructions to prepare shelters. But even with these warnings, many people struggled to believe that their own street, their own home, could ever be touched. There is a famous account from London. From the early days of the Blitz, a woman described how she had heard the sirens many times but had never taken them seriously. She thought they were just practice. And then one night she heard the sound of explosions in the distance, and then closer, and then on her own block. That was the moment, she said, when the war became real. Not when she read about it, not when she heard about it, but when she felt it shake the walls of her own house. This is the experience that millions of civilians throughout history have shared. The sudden, jarring shift from ordinary life to something entirely different. One day you are worried about whether you have enough milk for breakfast. The next day you are worried about whether your house will still be standing by evening. The speed of this change is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not lived through it. The human mind is not designed to process such rapid transformation, and yet people did process it. They adapted. They survived. But before they could adapt, they had to let go of the world they knew, and that is perhaps the hardest part. The last days of normal are not dramatic. They are quiet. They are filled with small moments that only become meaningful in hindsight. A father fixing a broken chair, not knowing it would be destroyed within a week. A child finishing a school assignment that would never be graded. A couple arguing about something small, not knowing they would soon face challenges that made their argument seem meaningless. These moments are not recorded in history books. There are no monuments to them, but they are the foundation of every story of survival. Because before people can show courage, they must first lose their sense of safety. Before they can rebuild, they must first watch everything fall apart. If you have ever wondered what it would feel like to live through such a moment, think about the most ordinary day of your life. The day when nothing happened. The day you cannot even remember because it was so unremarkable. Now imagine that was your last ordinary day. That everything after it would be different. That is what millions of people throughout history have experienced. And in the next part of this story, we will see what happened when that ordinary life ended. When the streets they knew became unrecognizable. When they had to make decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. What would you do if your last ordinary day was today? Think about it. Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story is making you think differently about history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The next part of this documentary will take us into the moment when everything changed. The first night is always the longest. There is a survivor's account from Rotterdam in May 1940. A factory worker described how he was eating dinner with his family when they heard a sound they had never heard before, a low rumble in the distance. Then the windows shook. His wife grabbed their youngest child. His older daughter started crying. And in that moment, he realized he had no idea what to do. He had never been trained for this. He had never imagined this. He was just a man who made shoes for a living. And now he was supposed to protect his family from something he could not see, could not understand, and could not stop. That feeling of complete helplessness is where every story of civilian survival begins. Not with courage, not with a plan, but with confusion and fear. If you are finding value in these stories, take a second to subscribe. We explore the human side of history, the moments that textbooks leave out. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. When danger first arrives in a city, there is no instruction manual. No one hands out a guide that explains what to do when your world falls apart. People have to figure it out in real time, often in the dark, often with incomplete information. In London during the Blitz, the government had prepared some shelters and issued some guidelines. But when the bombing actually started in September 1940, most civilians were still caught off guard. A woman who lived through it later wrote that the hardest part was not knowing how long it would last. One night? 1 week? Forever? That uncertainty was almost worse than the danger itself, because the human mind can handle almost anything if it knows when the suffering will end. But when there is no end in sight, every hour feels like a year. The first response for most people is denial. This cannot really be happening. This must be a mistake. Surely it will stop soon. In Stalingrad in 1942, many civilians refused to evacuate even when they were told the city was about to become a battlefield. They did not believe it. They had lived there their whole lives. How could their home suddenly become a place of destruction? Some of them had the chance to leave on boats crossing the Volga River. They chose to stay. Not because they were foolish, but because leaving meant accepting that everything they knew was gone. And that acceptance takes time. Sometimes more time than people have. But denial cannot last forever. Eventually, reality forces its way in, and when it does, something remarkable happens. People start to adapt. Not all at once, and not without struggle, but they adapt. A schoolteacher in besieged Leningrad began holding classes in a basement shelter. There was no heat, barely any light, and the children were hungry. But she taught them anyway. She later said that keeping a routine was the only way to stay sane. The children needed something normal to hold on to. So did she. That instinct to maintain normalcy in the middle of chaos appears again and again in survivor accounts. People cling to small rituals. A morning cup of tea, even if the tea is weak. A prayer before bed, even if the bed is a cold floor. These rituals do not change the situation, but they change how people feel about the situation. And sometimes that is enough to keep going. The transformation of a city under pressure happens faster than anyone expects. Streets that were once busy with shoppers become empty. Buildings that were once homes become shelters. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other suddenly become essential to each other's survival. In the Warsaw ghetto, communities formed around shared resources. One family had a hidden stove. Another had a small supply of medicine. A third had connections to get food from outside. Separately, none of them could survive. Together they had a chance. This kind of cooperation is not automatic. It requires trust. And trust is difficult when everyone is afraid. But again and again, history shows that most people choose cooperation over isolation. Not because they are saints, but because they understand that survival is easier in groups. Children adapt in ways that adults often cannot. In cities across Europe during the Second World War, children invented games using whatever they could find. They played in bombed-out buildings. They created imaginary worlds that helped them escape the real one. A psychologist who studied child survivors later noted that play was not a distraction from trauma. It was a way of processing trauma. Children who could still play were children who could still hope, and hope, in these situations, is not a luxury. It is a survival tool. The role of women in these transformations cannot be overstated. In almost every account of civilian survival, women are at the center of daily operations. They organized food distribution. They cared for the sick and elderly. They maintained the networks that kept families connected. In Leningrad, women made up the majority of workers who kept essential services running during the siege. They drove trams, they worked in factories, they cleared rubble from streets. Many of them were doing jobs they had never done before, learning as they went, making mistakes and trying again. A survivor later recalled watching her mother walk miles through freezing temperatures to get water from a frozen river. She did this every day for months. Not because she was a hero, but because her family needed water and no one else could go. The psychological pressure of living in a transformed city is difficult to describe. Every sound becomes a potential threat. Sleep becomes shallow and interrupted. Food becomes an obsession because there is never enough. People who lived through the London Blitz described a constant state of alertness that never fully went away, even years after the war ended. The body remembers danger long after the mind tries to forget. But even in this state of constant stress, people found moments of connection. A shared joke in a shelter. A song sung quietly in the dark. A stranger offering half of their bread to someone who had none. These moments do not undo the suffering, but they prove that humanity survives even when everything else seems destroyed. As the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months, something strange happens. The abnormal becomes normal. People stop being surprised by things that would have shocked them before. A collapsed building is just part of the scenery. A night without sleep is just another night. This normalization is both a defense mechanism and a danger. It helps people cope in the short term, but it can also lead to a kind of emotional numbness that takes years to heal. Survivors often describe feeling like they were watching their own lives from a distance, as if it were happening to someone else. This disconnection is the mind's way of protecting itself from overwhelming pain. But here is the part that matters most. Even in the worst circumstances, people made choices. They were not just victims of history. They were active participants in their own survival. A baker in a besieged city chose to keep baking even when flour was almost gone. A doctor in a bombed hospital chose to keep treating patients even without proper supplies. A mother chose to tell her children stories at night to help them sleep. These choices did not change the war. They did not stop the destruction. But they changed the people who made them. And they changed the people who witnessed them. In the next part of this documentary, we will see what happens when the immediate danger finally passes. When people emerge from shelters and basements to see what remains of their world. And we will explore the hardest question of all. How do you rebuild a life after everything you knew has been destroyed? Think about the people in your own life. The ones who keep going no matter what. The ones who hold everything together when times get hard. Drop a comment and tell us about them. And if this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. History is not just about the past. It is about understanding what humans are capable of when everything is taken away. There is a photograph from Berlin taken in May 1945. A woman is standing in the middle of a street that no longer looks like a street. Everything around her is rubble. Buildings that once stood 5 stories tall are now piles of broken stone. And she is just standing there, looking around, holding a small bag. That bag probably contained everything she owned. Her expression is not relief, it is not joy, it is something harder to describe. A kind of emptiness. The danger had passed, but she did not look like someone who had been saved. She looked like someone who did not yet know how to feel anything at all. That photograph captures something that most people do not think about when they think about survival. The moment after, the silence that comes when the noise finally stops. And the impossible question that every survivor must face: what now? If you have been following this series, make sure you are subscribed. We are telling the stories that history often forgets. The human stories, the ones that matter most. Survival is not an ending. It is a beginning. And for millions of civilians who lived through urban warfare, that beginning was almost as difficult as what came before. When people emerged from shelters and basements, they often did not recognize their own neighborhoods. Streets they had walked their entire lives were gone. Landmarks they had used to navigate were destroyed. A woman from Dresden described walking through her city after the bombing in February 1945 and getting lost in a place she had lived for 30 years. Nothing looked familiar. The bakery where she had bought bread every morning was a hole in the ground. The church where she had been married was a burned shell. She said it felt like waking up in a foreign country, except the foreign country was her home. The first challenge after survival is practical. Where do you sleep tonight? Where do you find water? Where do you find food? In cities across Europe and Asia after the Second World War, these questions consumed every waking moment. Survivors dug through rubble looking for anything useful. A pot, a blanket, a photograph of someone they had lost. The economy of survival is brutal. Things that had no value before suddenly become precious. A working stove could mean the difference between life and death in winter. A pair of intact shoes could determine whether someone could walk far enough to find help. People traded whatever they had. Family heirlooms exchanged for bread. Wedding rings exchanged for medicine. The material possessions of a lifetime reduced to bargaining chips. But the physical rebuilding, as hard as it was, often proved easier than the emotional rebuilding. The body heals faster than the mind. Survivors of prolonged urban warfare frequently described a strange feeling of disconnection that lasted for months or even years after the danger passed. They were alive, but they did not feel alive. They went through the motions of daily existence without feeling present in their own lives. Psychologists who studied survivors in the decades after the Second World War documented what they called delayed trauma responses. People who had functioned well during the crisis suddenly collapsed emotionally once the crisis ended. It was as if the mind had put all the pain in a box during the emergency, and once the emergency was over, the box opened all at once. Children who survived these experiences carried the marks into adulthood in ways that are still being studied today. A researcher who interviewed elderly survivors of the Leningrad siege in the 1990s found that many of them still could not throw away food. Even 50 years later, with full refrigerators and stable incomes, they hoarded bread. They kept extra supplies hidden in closets. The fear of hunger had become part of who they were. It had rewired their relationship with something as basic as eating. Their grandchildren sometimes found this behavior strange, not understanding that it came from a time when a piece of bread could save a life. The social fabric of communities also had to be rebuilt, and this was often complicated. During the crisis, people had made difficult choices. Some had shared generously. Others had hoarded. Some had helped neighbors. Others had looked away. When the danger passed, these memories did not disappear. A woman who had refused to share water with a dying neighbor now had to live on the same street as that neighbor's family. A man who had reported someone to authorities to protect his own family now had to face the consequences of that decision. Communities had to find ways to move forward while carrying the weight of what had happened. Some chose to forgive. Some chose to forget. Some chose neither and lived with the tension for the rest of their lives. The question of justice after survival is one of the most complicated in human history. Who is responsible for what happened? How do you assign blame when an entire city was swept up in forces beyond any individual's control? In the years after the Second World War, societies across Europe struggled with these questions. Trials were held, punishments were given. But for most ordinary civilians, justice was not found in courtrooms. It was found, if it was found at all, in the slow process of rebuilding a life that felt worth living. A factory worker who returned to his job. A teacher who reopened her school. A couple who finally had the wedding they had postponed for years. These small victories were their own form of justice against the chaos that had tried to destroy them. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the aftermath is how many people chose to stay. After everything they had endured, after losing homes and loved ones in years of their lives, many survivors chose to remain in their cities and rebuild. They could have left. Some did leave, starting over in new countries, new continents, new lives. But many stayed. A man who survived the siege of Leningrad was asked years later why he never moved away. He said the city held his memories, the good ones and the bad ones. Leaving would have meant abandoning the people he had lost, because they only existed now in the places where they had lived together. The streets might be rebuilt, the buildings might be new, but the ground remembered. The legacy of these experiences extends far beyond the people who lived through them. Entire generations were shaped by what their parents and grandparents survived. The children of survivors grew up hearing stories, or sometimes grew up in silence because the stories were too painful to tell. Either way, they inherited something. A caution about the fragility of peace. A respect for ordinary comforts that others take for granted. A knowledge, deep in their bones, that the world can change overnight, and that the people who survive are not always the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes they are simply the ones who refuse to give up. History remembers generals and politicians. It remembers battles and treaties, the mother who walked miles for water, the teacher who held classes in a basement, the factory worker who did not know how to protect his family, but tried anyway. These are the people who carried civilization through its darkest moments, not because they were heroes, but because they were human. And being human means finding a way forward even when there is no path. This is where their story ends, but it is not where the lessons end. Every person watching this video lives in a city. Every person has neighbors and routines and small daily comforts. And every person, somewhere in their family history, has an ancestor who survived something that should have been impossible to survive. Think about that ancestor. Think about what they went through so that you could be here today. If you know their story, share it in the comments. And if you do not know their story, maybe this is the time to ask. Share this video with your family. Start that conversation, because these stories deserve to be remembered. And the people who lived them deserve to be honored. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for remembering.